Welcome to the Plant-Centered and Thriving podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Kitchens. Welcome to the show, Plant-Centered listener. My name is Ashley and I am your host today. And today's episode, or at least the intro, is going to be a little bit different from what you're used to because this intro comes with an enthusiastic and a heavy heart that I share some important news about our podcast moving forward. As we go into this episode, it also marks a pause, a moment of reflection and a hiatus for our beloved show. So first, I want to talk about the why, the reason behind our decision. When I say our, I mean Katie, who's my amazing co-host, and I's decision to take a break. Life, as it has it, it has its way of doing its own thing, and it has pulled me and my amazing team in different directions. The demand of other areas in my life and business are calling for a bit more attention, leading me to simplify my life and business operations, which means taking a pause with the podcast. Also, my lovely podcast editor and co-host Katie is pursuing other passions, and we both fully support this new chapter. I'm very excited for her. Looking back, I will say I am incredibly overwhelmed with pride for how far this podcast has come, and I have you to thank for it. We've had almost 300,000 downloads. This is our 164th episode, and we've had listeners in 142 countries all across the world, which is amazing. These numbers are more than just stats. They are a testament to the dream we turned into reality almost 3 years ago and the amazing community that we've built together. And again, I just want to thank you. Each download truly marks a story we've shared, a conversation about the transformative power of plant-based eating and the lives that it has that they've touched and changed. And I am just so incredibly grateful. The future of the podcast is uncertain at this time. I'm not sure when or if we'll be back on the airwaves, on the show, in your earbuds. This space was born out of a dream. I really had thought about starting this podcast for years, and it finally happened about 3 years ago. And we have celebrated so many milestones over the past 3 years, and primarily just being able to share success stories of people who have changed their lives with plant-based eating. So I'm immensely proud and forever grateful. And to you, our listener, I hope these stories have inspired you as much as they have inspired me. Your support, your engagement, and the community we've created together has been the heartbeat of this show. And again, I'm just so thankful. Saying thank you really just doesn't quite capture the depth of my gratitude, but from the bottom of my heart, thank you for tuning in, for sharing these episodes, and for being part of this incredible journey. Although we're pressing pause for now, the stories, the conversations, and the impact we've made continue to resonate. I encourage you to revisit past episodes, share them with friends and family, and to continue the conversation about the power of plant-based living in whatever way feels best to you. In closing, this really is not goodbye, because you know where to find me. I'm on social media, but it's more of a see you later, at least for now, with the podcast. The world is filled with stories that need to be told and voices that need to be heard. And I hope in one way or another, we can continue to all be a part of those narratives. So with today's episode, I've actually been excited to share this episode with you for probably a month now. If you like to nerd out over nutrition, this episode is for you. I want to introduce you to Mel Weinstein, who has a master's in organic chemistry. He is a former chemistry educator and retired research analytical chemist for a global food ingredient company. Are your ears perking up? Do you know which direction we're going in? Mel's mission is to share knowledge that he has gained over the past 20 plus years about the commercial food industry. Research continues to show that the rising rates of chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and other lifestyle diseases is linked to many things, including the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, which are often comprised of synthetic additives. At the end of 2022, Mel published a book called Fast Food Ingredients Revealed. What are you eating? This book arose from topics discussed on his monthly podcast called Food Labels Revealed, which first aired in 2016. The book that he wrote is really the first of its kind. It delves into the basic ingredients found in the menu items of 3 iconic American fast food restaurants, which is pretty fascinating. These ingredients are categorized by their degree of industrialization and how far from, quote, nature or natural the food has evolved. The book also discusses how some countries, which the US is not one of them, and how they are using front of package labeling to help their citizens make healthier food choices. We talk about what an ultra processed food actually is. We talk about the Food and Drug Administration's role in approving or denying new additives, which I found particularly mind-blowing. We also talk about what does natural flavors actually mean on an ingredients list, because I know that you've had that question. I still have that question. I'm like, okay, well, what actually is this? And so much more. So I hope you find this episode as fascinating as I did. I really want you to take care and keep making a difference and never underestimate the power of a plant-based lifestyle to change the world. Please join me in welcoming Mel to the show. Mel, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
I will enjoy this interview a lot. I like to talk about this stuff.
Yes. I know you're a perfect person to talk about this. So I'm curious just to kind of get us started, Mel, after really a couple decades as an analytical chemist in food ingredients and a multitude of things, what really sparked your curiosity about the impact of ultra processed foods, industrial foods, I guess in general, on our health?
Well, it took a long time for me to concentrate on that. When I was younger, I didn't give a hoot about what I ate. As long as it tasted good. I had a big sweet tooth. I enjoyed lots of different candies and desserts and things like that. So as I was growing up, there was nothing to kind of point me in that direction. But once I decided to become a chemistry major, and then I became a chemistry teacher, started to get more interested in what was actually in foods. And I wound up actually teaching a couple of classes that dealt with that subject in terms of consumer chemistry. And those are kinds of questions that were raised in those courses. What's in our environment? What's in the kitchen? What's in the foods that come from commercial companies? So I did develop an interest probably in my mid 20s in that area. And then after I stopped teaching, I taught for about 10 years. And I went into industry as an analytical chemist and did that, as you mentioned, for 20 years. I found myself, confronted with the actual ingredients that were going into commercial foods. Because the company I worked for, it's called Tate and Lyle out of England, it did not make any foods that were sold directly to consumers. They prepared additives from primarily corn and soybeans that were sold to the commercial food companies to put into their foods. So on that end of it, I definitely saw the industrial side of food preparation, and particularly a host, dozens, if not hundreds of additives that went into commercial foods. So it was at that point I started to ask questions. Okay, what were these things? Were they impacting our health? Should I be avoiding them? So that's really when my interest in what winds up in commercial foods developed. So I was probably at that point in my 40s. So it took a long time, for me to start asking questions about what winds up in commercial foods. And then it was even later when I started my podcast, which was in 2016. It's called Food Labels Revealed, that I started digging deeper into questions of, okay, how does the consumption of a diet rich in commercial foods, particularly ultra-processed foods, affect our health? And then a couple of years ago, 2022, I was working on my book, which is called Fast Food Ingredients Revealed. And that's when I started digging deeper in terms of researching, what were the notable health issues associated with eating diets that's very high in ultra processed foods. And I came across dozens of research studies taken together, really pointed to the hazards associated with consuming a diet like that. And I put that at the end of my book in a chapter that kind of summarized some of the most recent and important studies that have been done.
And I appreciate that there's more and more research coming out showing the effects of eating a diet high in ultra processed foods on our health and amongst many other things. So it's just kind of neat to see that research is coming out more and more and more. And hopefully we learn some things from it in the meantime.
Can I share with you just a recent article that I came across?
Please, yes.
And this is dated February 20th of this year. So very current. Okay, I'll just read you the title and the summary, because I think it's really pointing directly to what we're talking about here. So this is out of Florida Atlantic University. The title is, "Could ultra-processed foods be the new silent killer?" Hundreds of novel ingredients never encountered by human physiology are now found in nearly 60% of the average adult's diet and nearly 70% of children's diets in the U.S. An emerging health hazard is the unprecedented consumption of these ultra-processed foods in the standard American diet. This may be the new silent killer, as was unrecognized high blood pressure in previous decades. So wow. I thought that was kind of telling.
Yes, very telling, very timely too. I'm actually curious, Mel, if you wouldn't mind defining what ultra-processed foods are, because we know that those are a bit different from mechanically processed foods, just so that we're all aware of what those are.
The word ultra-processed actually is fairly new. It goes back, I think, to around 2009. There was a professor out of the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. His name is Carlos Monteiro, and he's done a lot of research into the effects of industrial foods on human health. And so he coined that word. And now everybody uses it, right? It didn't take all that long for that to become just very common in our language. And it's an important word because if you just talk about processed foods, to me, the word processed is very generic. It doesn't have a whole lot of meaning, because you could take a piece of fruit, let's say, and give it a good washing, clean off the dirt, make it presentable to somebody who wants to eat it. And that's really a processed food. Yes, it's lightly processed, but it's really important to distinguish foods that have very little processing versus ones that have a lot of processing. So that's where the word ultra-processed comes in. Dr. Monteiro actually developed a classification system called NOVA, that's N-O-V-A, which became kind of the classic way to classify different foods in terms of their processing, and has been adopted primarily by European countries to basically judge a food in terms of the degree of processing that it has. So there's like 4 categories, which I won't go into because we probably don't have the time, but they range from basically unprocessed all the way through. The last one would be ultra processed. So it goes from what we would consider, friendly, healthy foods to foods that we probably either shouldn't be eating or eat very, very little of. And that's what these studies I mentioned before are addressing, is the amount of ultra-processed foods that people have in their diets. And what has been found is that the higher the percentage of ultra-processed foods in the diet, the higher the risk of lifestyle diseases, such things as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, metabolic diseases, and so on and so on. Now, what is an ultra-processed food? As Dr. Monteiro defined it, it's basically a food that starts out natural, okay? And then through the wonders of food science and food technology, that food gets broken down into components. And those components may be industrially modified, then they are reincorporated into a commercial food product. So they no longer look like, smell like, act like, the foods that came from the original plants, let's say. So that is an ultra processed foods. I mean, a good example would be a potato chip. Think about what a potato goes through to become a potato chip. So it starts as a natural food, right? And potato out of the ground, it gets cleaned up, it gets cut up, it gets sliced up into small pieces. So then it can go into a fryer to become a potato chip. But in that process, the potato is having additives added to it for flavor, for appearance, for preservation. And then there's all kinds of fat added to it, right? And salt. And so it becomes a highly modified form of the potato, which is now ultra processed. And that is an extreme change from its original form, which most people would agree was probably pretty healthy. Just to eat a potato, just throw a potato in water and boil it and then eat it is a pretty healthy food to eat. But ultra processed foods eliminate a lot of the nutritional quality of the food, and in fact may alter the food to the extent where not only is it less nutritious, but now it's a health challenge if you eat that kind of food as a large part of your diet.
That's fascinating. I love the potato chip example because you said it's highly modifiable. And even the word that came to mind after you said that is it's also highly palatable. So it's just something that is so easy to eat versus a potato. You get pretty full eating a baked potato.
Yeah. That's the thing about food science. It's not always doing things that are beneficial to humankind. And what you just mentioned, the idea of hyperpalatability, that the food scientists who are making these ultra processed foods are very, very aware of how to modify a food to make it taste so good that people are going to get kind of hooked to it. And I certainly admit to having that issue as I was growing up. And I mean, I didn't come across the word hyperpalatability until probably in the last 10 years. So I didn't know what was going on either for most of my life, that I was being, encouraged to eat these foods. And by eating them, I wanted to eat more of them. And by eating more of them, I was endangering, my health in the long run. Not a pleasant thing to think about, but knowledge is power. So as you become more and more familiar with how food is manipulated and changed for commercial interests, then you can begin to understand, well, maybe I shouldn't be eating a lot of that or none of it. Maybe I should be eating foods in their nutritious, whole forms, uncontaminated by lots of different chemicals. And we haven't even talked about additives yet.
Yes. I was actually curious to ask you about additives because obviously we know that additives serve their function, they serve a place in our food system, but I'm kind of curious your opinion on them and how they're sort of justified by the food industry in a way.
Yeah, well, additives, there's good ones and there's bad ones. Here's a key thing to keep in mind. Most food companies, not all food companies, but most food companies, particularly the big ones, are not making foods to help our health, to make sure that we're eating nutritiously, that there's nothing going to be harmful in these foods to our health. Their main concern is to sell food, right? It's a commercial interest. It's strictly, for many of these companies, a capitalist endeavor where they have, if they're public companies, they have shareholders. So their job essentially is to make very successful commercial foods. And this includes many of the products we see in grocery stores, as well as the fast food restaurants that are out there. And they're going to make a product that meets certain expectations. In the case of let's take a fast food restaurant like McDonald's. Okay, what's important to them is to make something that tastes delicious. It looks good, it smells good, it tastes great. And the other thing that you want to keep in mind is uniformity. Okay, that's a big deal, because if you're a McDonald's executive, you want to make sure that whatever is sold in a McDonald's restaurant appears the same to everybody everywhere. You go into a McDonald's anywhere in the country or the world, you know what you're going to get. So you need to mass produce it, number one. Number two, you want that food product to be stable. So you're going to add whatever it takes to the food, such as preservatives, to make sure that that food doesn't change over time. So it lasts as long as it can last. And so that's where additives come in. The additives are there to create a consistent product. It's a big deal. Most people don't realize the amount of food science that goes into the preparation of these commercial foods. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of chemists and food scientists and food technologists who, through their creativity, are able to invent these foods that didn't exist in the past using additives, chemicals that never existed in the past. Think about the modern food industry, commercial food industry. It's only been around for a couple of hundred years. And, we have been around for a 500,000 years, right? So it's relatively new that all of these chemicals that didn't exist several hundred years ago are now circulating in our food system. And so it's a real concern. A lot of people are getting concerned about what these chemicals are doing ultimately.
Absolutely. And I actually think about that a lot with sodas. I have people in my life who like to have a couple sodas a day. And I think about the people behind creating those sodas are brilliant because they are creating those sodas so that you just keep coming back and you keep coming back to the same one. Because those diehard soda drinkers, I mean, they're, either hardcore Pepsi or hardcore Coke, that type of thing.
They're dedicated. So,
yes, very. Yeah. Well, I'm actually curious, Mel, too. Do you have an estimate on how many food additives currently exist in our food supply?
Okay, I have a rough estimate. It's really hard to put your finger on it. It's something like 9,000 to 10,000 additives that are approved for use in the American food system. And that number is going to vary because there are food additives that come and go. They may be popular and useful early on, but then they get replaced by something else. But they're still on the list as far as possible food additives that could wind up in commercial foods. Now, it's difficult to really pin that number down because as far as I know, there is no single resource that you can go to that shows you the whole list of food additives that are used, what their names are, what their properties are, where they are used, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, but not even our government has such a list. If you go to the FDA's website, Food and Drug Administration, there is a page called Substances Added to Food Inventory. Substances added to food inventory. But if you look at that list, it only has less than 4,000 entries. So as I said, there's like 9,000 to 10,000. So that's only a fraction of what may possibly be in commercial foods. And so if anybody out there in your audience is aware of a single resource that lists every food additive, I'd like to hear about it because in my experience, my experience, I have not come across that yet.
Could you just maybe list a couple common food additives that we might see when we're at the grocery store?
Oh gosh, where do I start? While I was doing my research, I got curious about the question, are the food additives that we see in the foods that we buy in grocery stores, big box stores, convenience stores, are those food ingredients also used by the fast food industry? And so I started looking at whatever fast food restaurants actually revealed what was in their foods, started looking at the additives. And overall, it turns out that most of the additives that are in fast foods are the same ones that you see on food labels in the commercial foods and stores. And so in terms of some of the common ones, and this gets to be a difficult question to answer. And so one of my pet peeves is that the government, through the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, allows for some vague terms to be used on food labels. And everybody knows about these, but maybe haven't thought about them too much. And so there are specific names that I can give you, but there's also very generic names and that don't give you a whole lot of information, which is kind of a problem. So as far as food additives that you maybe would see on food labels, and this is one I used to have to deal with when I was a working chemist. Have you seen the word maltodextrin?
Yes. Yep.
Maltodextrins. That's actually not a single ingredient. It's a mixture. It's a word that covers a bunch of similarly related chemicals. And maltodextrins are essentially starch molecules, and starch can come from a number of different sources, right? You can have cornstarch, wheat starch, rice starch, and so on. This is starch that has been partially broken down, either chemically or using enzymes, to some intermediate form. Now, if you take starch and you break it all the way down, you get dextrose or glucose, right? Okay, so maltodextrins are some form that's kind of partly in between the original starch and the sugar, dextrose. And so they essentially represent a range of sweetness and a range of texture between starch and glucose. So if you could have a sweet maltodextrin, or you could have a not very sweet or non-sweet maltodextrin. So they tend to be used sometimes for sweetness, but oftentimes as texturizers. They produce a certain texture in the food product that creates, the desirable mouth feel as you're eating that food. And it's a very complicated area. And well, what I was saying before, when you see maltodextrin listed on the label, it doesn't tell you specifically what you're eating. So it's a range of substances that fall into a category. And so it's a little deceptive there. Another deceptive term that you often see, well, actually two of them are kind of related. You see natural flavors, or you may see artificial flavors. Okay.
Oh, yes. I feel like I see that
Uh,
all the time.
all the time. It's in the top 5. So natural flavors, what does that mean? Well, that could be hundreds or thousands of different substances. All you know is the word natural means that these flavors were derived from some natural source. So it could be plants, it could be animals, it could even be microbial. So it's not much information. And if you're somebody who is maybe sensitive to one of those flavors, you may have an allergy or some other kind of sensitivity to it, you're not going to know it. So that's a pet peeve of mine as well, that the Food and Drug Administration allows food manufacturers to use that kind of terminology on food labels. And the same is true for color. There's natural colors and there's synthetic colors. So it is a little bit of information, but it's not complete information that
Yeah.
shows up on the label.
Yeah, I'm curious with your insider perspective how you would sort of describe the FDA's role in the regulatory process for additives. I mean, it seems a little confusing, especially when they're allowing things like natural flavors, where, like you said, it could be 100,000 different these two little words on the ingredient label.
Right.